Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who's joining this discussion today. So I'm Jessie Popp, and I'm actually a new professor to the University of Guelph. I just started a few weeks ago, but I'm beaming in today from Sudbury, Ontario, which is about 4.5 hours north of Guelph, and it's residing on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. So I am a member of Wikwemikong Unceded Territory, which is a First Nation located in Manitoulin Island in Ontario. And I'm a wildlife ecologist. So basically, I study wildlife and the relationships between wildlife and their environments. I do a lot of large mammal research, working with elk and moose and bear and wolves. I don't know if you can see the picture behind me, but this is actually one of the bear photos that I took during some of my research. So I get to work with some really cool animals, and I do a lot of my work focuses on populations and the impacts of the environment to population sizes. So for example, if moose numbers are decreasing, I try to find out why. So, what about the environment or what kind of impacts that people are having is causing those numbers to decline? And that's really important for conservation. So in my work, I take an approach that brings together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing in science. And I'm going to talk to you more about that today, but my talk in general is about why Indigenous perspectives are so important in environmental science and biodiversity conservation. But before we get too much into that, I want to first start with a little bit of the history in North America or Turtle Island. So Turtle Island or North America has been inhabited by Indigenous people for thousands and thousands of years. Many Indigenous peoples call North America Turtle Island. And this is just an image I found online that shows a graphical representation of North America overlain with that turtle. So Indigenous people being the inhabitants in North America for thousands of years, developing really close relationships, respectful relationships with the environment and with nature. Nature provides us everything we need. The earth provides us with everything we need. So having a respectful relationship and giving back and caring also for the earth has been very important for generations. Indigenous peoples have relied heavily on the land in order for survival through hunting, gathering, through agriculture, and so on, and have been the first scientists in North America. So Indigenous people inhabiting North America up until about 1492, when Christopher Columbus stumbled across Turtle Island, across the Americas. So you may have heard before that Christopher Columbus discovered America, which we know is incorrect because Indigenous people were already inhabiting Turtle Island. So Christopher Columbus was an explorer who came from Europe and exploring by sea in ship and looking actually initially for alternative trade routes to Asia. So when he stumbled across Turtle Island, he thought he was actually stumbling across India, which was on his trip. And so that's where this word Indians came from for Indigenous people, which is incorrect because he didn't stumble across India, he stumbled across Turtle Island or North America. The term that we use today, the correct term we use today for the people who first inhabited Turtle Island is Indigenous people. And today, Indigenous people consist of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Now, when Christopher Columbus, around this time, 1492, coming from Europe, Europe was very impacted by people during that time. Great human population densities, but also large impacts on the environment. So when coming and seeing Turtle Island or North America, seeing a lush, very lush environment, and actually some thought that they were coming across the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is a place in the Christian Bible that describes a very lush, very productive environment. So people thought that's what they had found. Regardless of what people had thought, more people wanted to come see this new world. So explorers and people followed Christopher Columbus to see this place for themselves, to make a home for themselves, and to have opportunities here. Here's a graphical image of First Nations in the plains with an explorer overlooking a herd of buffalo. Historically, buffalo used to range so much on the plains, and there were so many of them that there were estimates about 60 million animals, which is a lot more than we have today. You could see buffalo sometimes as far as the eye could see, these big black herds because they grouped together. Now, buffalo were and still are today very important to First Nations in the plains. Buffalo are a highly respected animal and used, harvested, but every single part of the animal was used. And I talked about this respectful relationship that Indigenous people have with the environment. And respect is a very important component of that relationship, again, because the earth cares for us, so we care for the earth. And part of respect is using and not wasting, so using every part of the animal and not wasting anything. So buffalo bones could be used for tools, and meat could be used to eat, and hide could be used for warmth and bedding, for example. So buffalo weren't the only species that, had tons and tons of animals. The forest was lush, and many other animals. There were a lot of many other animals as well, like the passenger pigeon. So the passenger pigeon is extinct today, but when settlers arrived, they saw neither the beginning nor ending length and breadth of these millions and millions of birds. They were in such great measure that they obstructed the light of day. So here's just an image showing what that might have looked like historically. Flocks of birds so large, casting a shadow onto the ground and darkening the sky. This is actually where that saying came from, to kill two birds with one stone. So when you say I'm going to kill two birds with one stone, you're usually talking about I'm going to do two things with one action. I'm going to take two things off my list with one action. And passenger pigeons were so bountiful that you could almost throw a stone and get two birds at one time. And you could see in this image people shooting up in the air. So people started taking advantage of these birds for harvesting opportunities. So this was kind of what settlers were noticing when arriving to Turtle Island. Kretsch in his book says that other Europeans were awestruck by North America's natural world. They labored to describe what they encountered. Never had they seen birds and other animals in such profusion, fish and shellfish so large, or forests so expansive. Trees towered above them, producing prodigious quantities of nuts, berries, extensive beds of shellfish, blanketed estuaries and shorelines. Fish schooled, spawned, and even beached themselves in countless numbers. Birds darkened the sky and eclipsed the sun, and life teemed. And just imagine seeing an environment where there's just wildlife everywhere. So a lot of people, so stories were shared, and people, like I said, wanted to see this, wanted to be part of this, wanted to build a home, and more settlers started coming, also to be able to build a livelihood, to earn money from some of these animals, plants, species. Now, people started harvesting. Now, normally when you harvest, you can do so in a sustainable way. So for example, when you go fishing, or when you cut down trees, maybe for a fire, or when you shoot an animal for food, you can do this in a sustainable way, which means as long as you don't take too much, the environment will replenish itself. If you fish and you don't fish too much, next year there will be fish to replace that. If you take a few trees, next year the forest will regenerate. But if you start taking too much, you do so in an unsustainable way, that you start seeing declines in animal populations, and you start seeing depletion of habitat like forest, for example. So this is just an image of people historically with their fish catches hanging to dry, and you could see just how many fish were there. So people started overfishing. They started taking too many whales too many seals. They started over harvesting fur. So around this time, the fur trade happened, where people were trading animal furs for goods like guns, for example. So in the background here in this image, you can see, this is probably a trading post. You can see some foxes hanging up, a beaver pelt, and then all these bundles of furs. Furs became something that was really sought after by European settlers as something that was very fashionable. So for example, beaver pelts were used for hats, very fashionable items for hats. And they were overharvested so much that they almost disappeared. Now, we talked about how Indigenous people, especially in relation to buffalo, but all species, have this respectful relationship with the environment. And because of respect, don't waste anything. Don't kill an animal and leave it or leave parts of it. Use everything. And so we talked about how First Nations of the Plains use every part of the buffalo. But as settlers arrived and people saw, oh, look how many buffalo there are, we can get some of this fur and sell it for a lot of money. They started killing buffalo just for their fur and leaving everything behind wasted. And because there were so many buffalo, 60 million in the plains, there were a lot of furs. So here you can see this gentleman sitting on a stack of buffalo fur. Just imagine how many buffalo died to go into this pile. And animals started dying quickly and very fast in large amounts. There was the introduction of guns coming with European settlers, which First Nations didn't previously have. So how easy it would be to kill buffalo, especially in large herds that all group together. This is a mountain of buffalo skulls. You can see these two individuals standing on specific skulls to give you a sense of size. Tons and tons of animals were part of this pile. So very sad, and quickly things started disappearing. You can see in the background that there's a building there. That's a fertilizing plant that these buffalo and other bones were destined for. So the environment drastically changed. And I mentioned earlier that Indigenous people relied on the land for survival. Their way of life depended on nature. And so imagine having a way of life that depends on nature, and all of a sudden nature is disappearing all around you. So people just couldn't live the way they used to live, couldn't find those buffalo anymore or other animals that they're used to finding. So it got to the point in some regions, here's an image from the plains, where individuals were actually going around with carts in the fields to collect bones that were left behind from animals that hides were taken from, for example. And so individuals would trade these bones in for cans of meat. So life changed, the environment changed, impacts on Indigenous people were enormous. So biodiversity was collapsing, and biodiversity still is collapsing. This is an article that was published by the New York Times last week saying Earth's biodiversity is still collapsing. We have made some huge changes, and we aren't seeing those enormous declines that we were seeing originally shortly after European settlement. But we are still seeing declines, and we have to do something about it. We have to do more. And we have started. There is a movement to ensure that our biodiversity sticks around for generations. Organizations like Greenpeace are drawing attention to these enormous impacts that humanity is having on the environment. This is just an image showing, animals have nowhere to go as humans have influence on the environment. It's important to raise awareness, to understand what's going on so that we can make change. We're seeing movements, we're seeing conservation organizations happen, all to support conservation and change what's going on, to prevent these biodiversity collapses. Movements like Water is Life, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people come together to raise awareness about the importance of water and why we shouldn't pollute. Thinking about in terms of Indigenous worldview and way of seeing the world, and understanding things as interconnected, in that if you pollute water, you're polluting those plants that depend on the water, you're polluting those animals, you're polluting people. Everything is connected, and what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. So a lot of people coming together and raising awareness. Organizations like the World Wildlife Fund is one of many, many organizations that are raising money to try to make change, to move ahead with conservation initiatives. A lot of really good stuff going on. And we can make bigger changes if we work together. If government works together with academics and with nonprofit organizations and with conservation groups, with you, with me, with scientists. So I mentioned that Indigenous people were the first scientists on Turtle Island. Again, first scientists because they had to understand the ecology, biology of the land in order to survive. So, for example, here's two Indigenous people approaching a herd of buffalo disguised as wolves. And again, this is, historically where buffalo would just range as far as the eye could see. But Indigenous people had to learn a lot about the environment in order to successfully harvest buffalo, had to learn about migration patterns, habitat selection, life cycle behavior, predator-prey relationships. This is all biology and ecology. Indigenous people watched wolves and buffalo and could see that wolves would get pretty close to buffalo. And that's because buffalo weren't really afraid of wolves. All they had to do is turn around and face a wolf, and still today, because buffalo are huge and they can actually, if charging a wolf, can really hurt or even kill a wolf, and wolves know that. The wolves actually use a different predator strategy where when the herd is running away, they'll chase the herd, and animals that are slow and falling behind, from behind the wolves will get that animal, they'll jump on them and kill them. But unlike wolves, Indigenous people don't have to jump on a buffalo. They just have to get close enough that their bow and arrow or their spear will be effective. So here, getting close enough in this image. So understanding the biology, the ecology, the predator-prey relationships in the land in order to survive. And of course, so much more than that in terms of Indigenous science. Indigenous people understood the properties of many materials in nature. And because of that, developed many technological innovations, inventions. For example, the canoe. Here we have a birch bark canoe, which was invented. The canoe was invented by Indigenous people. We have moccasins, which are one of the comfiest shoes, originally made with moose hide, very durable material, waterproof. There's the parka, which was innovated by the Inuit, the warmest type of clothing that you can find, using animal hides in the region, for example, caribou fur. And caribou fur has hollow furs so that they can trap air and keep you really, really warm. Indigenous people invented snowshoes and different kinds of snowshoes depending on the environment, taking science and producing technological innovations, and many more. Indigenous people were responsible for the domestication of many foods, things like corns, beans, squash, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, coffee, even chocolate originated from Indigenous people, was domesticated by Indigenous people thousands of years ago. 3/5 of the world's crops now in cultivation originated from Indigenous people. So most of these foods that you eat. Indigenous people also developed many agricultural techniques. One being the three sisters here, this image I have of corns, beans, and squash. Growing these crops together allowed to increase productivity. So this corn stalk would grow high and the beans could just wind around corn growing up. The squash would work to shade the soil to prevent moisture loss and to prevent weeds from growing. And it's also a really good example, this three sisters way of growing things, to show that we can really work well together as opposed to working on our own. Indigenous people have a deep understanding of medicinal properties of plants, thousands and thousands of species that provide medicine for us. So there's many examples, but I'll go through two of my favorite with you. The branch on the left comes from a pine tree, and this leads into a story about when the settlers were arriving, coming by ship. They were traveling across the sea for long distances, and traveling across the sea didn't have the greatest variety of food, often missing things that were high in vitamin C. And because of that, people started developing scurvy, which was a disease because of low vitamin C, which could actually lead to death. Now, Indigenous people saw the signs of scurvy when settlers were arriving and made tonics and teas of pine needles to give to settlers, and settlers drank them and started getting better and better. And that's because pine needles are high in vitamin C. So one medicine. Another one, the other picture that we see is a willow tree. Indigenous people used the bark of the willow tree historically as pain reliever. And you can still do that today as pain reliever. And so with understanding a little bit more about the compounds in willow tree, we know that the willow tree bark contains acetylsalicylic acid, which is the active compound that you find in aspirin. So if you've ever had an aspirin to help fix your headache, that originated from Indigenous people. So this knowledge about the earth, this knowledge about the environment from experience has been passed down through generations by Indigenous people. And for the most part, associated with the culture has been passed down orally, verbally, through talking, through storytelling. Whereas with Western society or European society, sometimes called Western society, A lot of times information was passed down through writing. The differences between societies. And this knowledge that's passed down through generations is called Gikandasawan in Anishinaabemowan, or simply knowledge of the earth. There's other words that you might have heard: traditional ecological knowledge, for example, indigenous knowledge, aboriginal traditional knowledge. So all of these terms essentially meaning the knowledge held by indigenous people passed down through generations, knowledge about the earth. And this knowledge is shared from elders to youth. So elders are important people in communities who hold on to this information and share it. Now, Gikan or indigenous knowledge is intrinsically tied to community and to indigenous people's worldview. And a worldview is the way that you see the world, which has a major impact on the way that you interpret it. Now, different cultures have different worldviews, different nations have different worldviews, communities, families, and even individuals. They all have different worldviews. But there are similarities among indigenous peoples and thinking in comparison among Western society or society originating Eurocentric society, so from Europe. So sometimes we use that term Western worldview, for example, in indigenous worldview. So that's kind of the terminology that I'll use today. So having different worldviews can really complement one another. What you see versus what I see might be different. You might see something a little bit different than I do. You know, indigenous peoples might see something a little bit different than Western society. And these different worldviews can really complement one another. And this is where this concept, two-eyed seeing, comes in. This is a concept coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall. He's from Unama'ki or Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. And he says that two-eyed seeing can help you to better understand the world. So you can better understand the world by seeing through two lenses. So one lens with the strengths of indigenous ways of knowing and worldview, and one with the strengths of Western ways of knowing and worldview. And by seeing through two of these lenses, we can better understand the world, we can better understand the environment, we can better understand science. So I want to give you a few examples of how this two-eyed seeing approach, or different ways of knowing and different knowledges, come together to help us better understand environmental science and help us better with conservation. So this is an example about beluga whales, and beluga whales are a marine animal. They live in the ocean. And there was once a scientist who wanted to do some research on beluga whales just to learn about beluga whales in general. And he wanted to also talk to elders as well. So he talked to elders, and he said one elder started talking about beavers. Beavers this and beavers that. As we know, beavers are freshwater. They don't live in the ocean. So the scientist said, well, I had to at least stop the elder and steer the conversation back to the ocean. So he tried to do that. And the elder stopped him and said, don't you see? As beaver numbers increase, they dam up the rivers, which prevents the fish from reaching their spawning or reproducing grounds, which ultimately affects the beluga whales, because as the numbers of fish decrease, the beluga whales don't have that much food. He said, I never would have anticipated a connection between beaver and beluga. So this is a really good example of how indigenous worldviews and ways of knowing are tied to that knowledge of the land, and that indigenous people often view the environment and view things in general very holistically, seeing that everything is interconnected, even freshwater and ocean. Now, just imagine, for conservation purposes, how this could help. If, for example, you're seeing beluga numbers decrease and you know that you need to do something to save them, well, maybe we should turn and look at beavers. Another example, this one's with bowhead whales, and it's a bit older. It's an example from the 1970s. And scientists wanted to do a population survey of beluga whales in a certain area. So population surveys are very important for conservation because we have to count how many animals that are there in order to know if we need to help them increase in population size. The scientists did the survey in this region, and they found that there was less than 1,000 whales. And that was so alarming. That meant a drastic decline in the population, so much so that the International Whaling Commission seized all hunting of these whales. Meanwhile, elders sat back and they said, what are you guys talking about? Less than 1,000 whales. This isn't right. There's more like 7,000 whales out there. And these are people who depend on these whales and have a really good understanding of the biology and behavior of whales. So they got to talking with the scientists and learning about how their population surveys were done. And they said, well, it looks like in your surveys, you don't take into account that whales, they swim under the ice and they feed during migration. The scientists said, okay, so we're gonna infuse this information, this knowledge that was shared, and redesign our surveys and look in those places we didn't look before. And they found that there was closer to 8,000 whales. And they said it's an affirmation of ecological knowledge held by individuals who depend on whales for food, fuel, and shelter. And even with whales using every part of the whale to be respectful. So another great conservation story, because imagine, the concern of not having any whales, but really they are there. They're just in a different spot. Another example is with wolves. So this is an example coming from British Columbia, where elders approached scientists and they said, we have two types of wolves here in this region, two types. The scientists were like, what? And they said, yeah, we have inland wolves and we have coastal wolves. So scientists decided, well, let's look into this a little bit more. And they found, yeah, these elders were exactly right. There's two types of wolves. You have your inland wolves, which are your typical wolf. Big body size, long legs, and wolves need long legs because they have to run fast to chase deer, to chase prey like deer. So big in body size, eating your typical wolf diet, living in forests. But then you have these coastal wolves, which live on the coast of British Columbia, are smaller in body size, don't have these long legs, don't need to because they're focusing on completely different prey, things like shellfish and clams and fish, things that wolves don't typically eat. So the scientists realized that Indigenous people were right. These wolves were morphologically distinct, behaviorally distinct, and with more analyses, genetically distinct. So much so that they now require their own separate management and conservation plans. Chris Darremount, who's a researcher that did some work on these wolves, said for him the most exciting part of this work is how science and Indigenous knowledge, even though they're different approaches, can often point to the same conclusions. So really cool work, and those are just a few examples of many, many research that's happening today and conservation initiatives. In my own work, I said I do take this approach where I try to take this two-eyed seeing approach and bring Indigenous and Western ways of knowing together in science. And I'll give you two examples of some of the stuff that I'm working on right now. I do railway ecology work, which basically we're looking to determine the impacts of railways and trains on wildlife. And we're finding science doesn't know that railways do impact wildlife in huge ways and actually kill a lot of animals by trains hitting them. So when talking to my First Nation colleagues about this, a lot of people were saying, well, yeah, you should see what happens to our species at risk, our turtles. And turtles in Ontario, so this is in Ontario, turtles in Ontario, every species is a species at risk, a species that we need to focus conservation efforts on. So this was important and we wanted to learn more about this. So we got to talking with communities and with Magnetawan First Nation and Shawanaga First Nation and talking to community members and to elders, individuals who hold that knowledge, who live on the land and see some of these impacts. So Jerry Smith, for example, said, we find lots of turtles on the railway tracks. On hot days, those turtles step over the tracks. They don't even make it across the tracks sometimes because they start boiling right there on the spot and they die within the tracks. Well, this is very sad, but important. It's important. If turtles and species at risk are dying on the railways, we want to help them. We want to make sure that this stops. So we partnered up with Magnetawan First Nation and Shawanaga First Nation, and we through the Indigenous knowledge that was shared with us, we developed a study to determine, with Indigenous knowledge that guided the project, saying this is what you should be looking at, this is where you should be looking at, and when. So we started surveying the railways. We did find a lot of turtles dying on the railways, a lot of animals, in fact, dying on railways. This is a painted turtle, for example, that was getting stuck in the creosote on the railway tracks, something we didn't previously know, that Western science didn't previously know. And this is really important because now that we know this is happening, we can start developing conservation strategies to help prevent this. Are there ways that we can remove this creosote, for example, or help turtles get across? So really, really important. And we wouldn't have even done this study without Indigenous knowledge that was shared with us. So another project that we're working on is a moose project. Moose are actually in decline across Canada. Their numbers are decreasing and scientists don't really have all the answers as to why. Sorry about this, I don't know why the slides are advancing on their own, but I'll just keep flipping back. So yeah, moose are decreasing across Canada and we don't really understand why. But Indigenous people, people who have, lived on the land, who are seeing these trends throughout time, who have this intergenerational knowledge, can really share a lot of insights into what could be going on with moose. Elders are saying the moose just aren't calling back anymore. So during the rut, for example, hunters will go out and they'll call to moose and moose will call back, but that's not happening anymore. So how can we bring together Indigenous and Western knowledge, ways of seeing the world to understand what's happening with moose decline? So that's one project that we're currently looking at, and we're finding out a lot of things that are affecting moose that maybe we previously didn't understand or know about, things that we need to look into more. And with this work and talking to community members, we're also hearing a lot about how important moose are to community. Juanita Starr from one of the communities we work with in Ontario, Big Tugong Nishnawbik, said a lot of people don't realize, most people just see moose as food, but it's not just food. It's more than food. It's creating a circle of being. You're getting the teaching aspects, you're getting the social aspects, you're getting the value of moose far greater than any one person thinks. Moose are so important to the environment, but moose are also very important to Indigenous people. And that's something we need to consider in conservation efforts. We need to consider how important these animals are to the environment, but also to people. So by doing this, by taking approach, a two-eyed seeing approach, and by working together, we can really do some great things. When thinking about science and conservation and just in general, Jesse Wente, he's a broadcaster, an Anishinaabe broadcaster. He says that in thinking about inclusion and diversity, so think of a forest. Is there one kind of tree? No. That tells us the natural way is diverse. And here in this background, you can see this expansive forest full of all different kinds of species of trees. And this forest thrives with diversity. Just like we can make conservation thrive and science thrive with diversity and by being inclusive of multiple people's ways of knowing. We can make science better. And by making science better, we can make conservation better. We can make some real changes. Hopefully this isn't going to start going faster. It just keeps slipping. Sorry, guys. So anyway, so we can make science better. And I want to say that I know that this discussion, a lot of parts of it were sad. And probably a lot of the things that you hear in the news and maybe your teacher talking about, maybe your parents, climate change happening, all these different things happening to the environment. It can be depressing sometimes, but I want you to be hopeful and to know that we can make change. We can change this. I want to share a story with you that was shared with me by an elder, Elder Andrea Colfer from New Brunswick, from Elsie Booktook. And this is a story about a hummingbird and a forest fire. So the story she told was talking about this giant forest fire that was happening on the mainland. And all the animals ran out of the forest and they gathered on an island in the middle of a lake. And they were all scared and they didn't know what to do. And then they saw this hummingbird flying back and forth from the lake to the fire, back and forth, picking up water and flying to the fire and putting water on the fire, this little tiny hummingbird. And they said to the hummingbird, what are you doing? And the hummingbird looked at them and said, I'm doing what I can. This hummingbird didn't think it was too small to make a difference. It tried to do what it could. And just imagine if all those animals and if 1 million hummingbirds came together, what kind of impact they could have on that fire by all bringing water to that fire. So just a few little slides here. These are through my time on the internet and Facebook and stuff. I found these cool little quotes and I just wanted to share some of them with you that I really, really like. This one says that when small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. We might be, we might think that we're small, but we can make a difference, especially when we work together. When we all work together, we can make huge transformational changes. And this one says, if you think you're too small to make a difference, you haven't spent a night with a mosquito. I don't know if anyone's went camping, or sometimes maybe a mosquito will fly into your room with the lights off and all you can hear is the buzzing, but you have no idea where it's coming from. That tiny, tiny little mosquito is keeping you up at night. So there's no creature too small. There's no individual too small to make a difference. And finally, Lily Tomlin, this is a quote from Lily Tomlin saying, "I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that. And then I realized I am somebody. We are all somebody. You are somebody. I am somebody. And we all have the power to make a difference. And we can make impactful differences if we work together, and even more so if we're diverse and inclusive." Miigwech, thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Popp. That was awesome. And I loved the messages at the end, especially that everyone could do something. And I feel like, especially when it comes to something big like climate change and biodiversity loss, it seems like such a big, it seems like kind of doom and gloom sometimes because of everything going on in the news. So it feels good that we can feel empowered to make our own changes, and that will hopefully culminate to something better. If someone does something, it will hopefully culminate to something else. So we're gonna take we have some time for questions. I know you might have to leave a little bit early, so we can hopefully get some questions in before you have to go. But if you are on Zoom and you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A bar. It should be at the bottom of your screen, and Dr. Popp can answer those. And if you're on YouTube, you can feel free to type your questions into the chat, and I will be monitoring those. So ask away.
Maybe I can throw a question out there for people, and if anyone wants to respond or talk about it, they can. I guess I have a question for all the classrooms joining us today and individuals to ask: is Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous ways of knowing, is that something that you learned about in school or are learning about? And if not, is that something that you want to learn more about?
That's a very good question.
Well, I just want to say for me, first of all, that was an amazing presentation, very eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us. I think for me, when I was in school, we didn't really learn that, and that wasn't too, I want to say less than 10 years for me. But again, I learned a lot of this stuff through university and a lot of the training sessions that we have to do now. But I think it's super important, and I hope that they're integrating this within the school system. Um,
Yeah,
Anita,
I
is there
guess
anything on the, sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, when I was in school too, in elementary and high school, and even in the university, this wasn't
Mhm.
something that we learned about. But that's where the impact of change we can see, right? Because
Mhm.
this is something we are starting to see. We are being more inclusive, and we're starting to see it more in school and university and in talks like this one today. So it's a good example of how change can really happen.
Definitely. Same thing with Lisa. I didn't learn about this, unfortunately, at all during my elementary school, high school, even undergraduate studies at all. So I'm grateful to be able to know about it now, and especially being with Let's Talk Science and learning more and going through talks like this, I'm able to learn about it more. But unfortunately, we didn't get taught this. Unfortunately, we actually have two questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure if you can see them, but I'll read them out. So the first comment was, Indigenous knowledge hasn't been something I learned about in school, but I wish it was. We covered the history of Canada's interactions with Indigenous people, but that didn't touch on their knowledge. So it sounds like some similar experiences in terms of it not being integrated, unfortunately. Another question was, is there any organization we can join to learn more about Indigenous knowledge and its role in the environment conservation?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot of organizations today that are being inclusive and diverse in bringing Indigenous knowledge systems and considering Indigenous people more in environmental conservation. I think many are actually moving ahead with this, with being more inclusive and diverse. Um, for example, Nature United is a conservation organization that works a lot with Indigenous people on guardianship programs. So programs where Indigenous peoples are out monitoring the land and conserving the land, protecting the land, and to elevate Indigenous knowledge systems and values in conservation science. So there definitely are a lot of different ways that you can learn more and maybe even be involved if that's something that you're interested in.
Awesome. And then one question was, can you make the YouTube live available after the session so that we can send it to others who did make the live session? Thank you so much for this presentation. I found it extremely helpful and interesting, and I hope that more people can learn about these topics. To answer your question, yes, we will be making this live. We'll be making this video a permanent video on our YouTube probably sometime next week. It might just go through a little bit of editing before we put it on. But I think that's a really good point, and just educating others that may not know about this. So just sending this video over and seeing if people are interested in learning more is a great way to share knowledge about this kind of stuff. So yes, please feel free to check on our YouTube next week. Hopefully it will be up.
Yeah, I did want to add too, it's interesting to see a lot of the government funding agencies to really incorporate a lot of those equity, diversity, and inclusion, but as well as it has a section, it's like, are you Indigenous? So like, it's really great to see that they're actually moving forward with supporting Indigenous knowledge and incorporating that into science. And there's a new section now that I noticed this year. It says, does your study include equity, diversity, and inclusion? And it forces you to read through this like 2-pager on what it is and what it includes. So I'm very happy to see that they're incorporating this at the, the national funding level for any science that is out there.
And initiatives for this started with just a few people, like just a
Right.
couple individuals, a couple individuals here, there, and all people, and it cascading into like changes for everyone across the country. So.
Any last questions for Dr. Popp before we let her go? One thing I was going to ask about is obviously the population of the world is increasing. So the amount of people that are going to be on this planet, we're going to need more places to put them in terms of where are they going to live and feeding, what is it, like 9 billion or whatever the number is in the future. Do you have any insight on how we can think about how we harvest food or the way we go about producing food in a sustainable way in order to make this, sustainable for the future of our planet?
Yeah, well, the human population is growing. And when we think about human population too, we also think about like footprint. So that's like what kind of impact, each individual is having on the environment. So when you use a lot of the environment, you're having more of an impact, but you don't have to necessarily use so much of the environment. So if we can find ways that each of us is using less of the environment, I think we can, make a difference. And I think by kind of rethinking our relationship with the environment, sometimes people think about, people are separate from the environment. And some people think that the environment is there for us to take, for us to use, and it's there for us to, use for food and to help build. But if we think about the environment in terms of a relationship and that we're all related, so all my relations, I'm related to you, and I'm related to this bear behind, to the plants, to the animals. We're all interconnected. And again, going back to thinking about how the earth is caring for us, earth cares for us, and we should be reciprocal, and we should care back while being respectful. And maybe more if we think about things like that and think that we're very interconnected and not separate from the environment, and that anything we do to the environment is doing it to us. If we think in ways like that, it might change the way we use the environment. It might change our footprint, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one thing that might require some like a shift in perspective, or just not like more of like an awareness of what we're doing in tandem. Like everything is so connected, like you said, and we can't just think of it as like completely separate, because we are literally all part of this gigantic web. And if it's not in balance, then we're going to feel it in some way or another. So it's definitely learning to live in tandem with the planet, and not as using it as our very egocentric way of thinking, I guess. All right, I think that might be it for questions. I'm checking our YouTube, and I know there's a little bit of a delay, but I don't see any people commenting. So I think that means you did a good job in explaining everything. Maybe everyone's reflecting on what they can do, which is good. All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Popp, for joining us today. It was a very, very fascinating talk, and we can't wait to share it with everybody after it's on our YouTube channel. And thank you to everybody who's joined us this week for Science Literacy Week. It's been so busy, but so much fun. And hopefully you learned something new about biodiversity, and you feel empowered to, you know, join an organization or do your part, or write to government if that's something that is you're passionate about. So thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you at another Let's Talk Science event soon.
Anita, before we end this, I was just going to say, Dr. Popp, is there anything you wanted to plug, like where we can find more about your research, any Twitter handles or something that you want us to follow you on? That's totally cool with us.
Well, I am on Twitter, so you can find more information there. I often post things kind of related to the work that I do. I have a website if anyone's interested in learning more. It's thewiselab.ca. And I'd be happy, like, you can reach me through the website if anyone ever has any questions in the future or wants to chat about two-eyed seeing. I would love to connect with you. And I want to say thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you again for inviting me to be part of this.
Okay, thank you.
And welcome to Guelph. You just started at Guelph, so
I know.
Busy month for you. It's a weird time to be at Guelph and starting a position, but we're very lucky to have you, and I'm sure we'll touch base about other events sometime soon.
Sounds wonderful.
All right, take care, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.